Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a 4th of July edition of Adam's Music Box, where on that day in music history in 1987, John Fogerty headlined a concert to benefit Vietnam veterans. And it was the first time since the breakup of Creedence Clearwater Revival, a very bitter breakup that it was, that he played some of his classic songs from Creedence and, of course, some of his new songs from the 80s when he had a really big comeback and reminded the world just how great a songwriter that he was. Now, it was a unique time in history because when the Vietnam War ended, the media, the politicians, and some members of the public wanted to forget the war, even though it was a long war, it was a bloody war, it was a costly war, and it was a war that most people, even before it was over, realized was a mistaken war that should have never been fought in the first place. And it was a war where veterans had a very unique response to the war, even in the late 60s and early 70s when the war was at its worst in terms of actual combat on the ground. There was the famous incident of the veterans throwing their medals back at the Capitol and the White House. There were many veterans who joined the protesters. Even though the media, at least portions of the media, tried to present the protesters as anti-soldier or anti-veteran, one of the chants that I think was very important from that era was, "We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war." And many of the veterans who returned realized that, and they joined the protests. Now, when the veterans came back from that war, the incidents of post-traumatic stress disorder were very high. And this was almost certainly made worse by the fact that rather than being given a kind of compassionate welcome, let alone a hero's welcome, the vets that returned were treated very badly. And by this time, mental health budgets had been cut, and we saw the results of that: homelessness, psychosis, violence begetting violence. And it was quite sad. And no one really cared, no one with a public microphone at the time. Now, when the 80s came around, the Vietnam vets started to get at least some of the attention that they deserved. A Vietnam Veterans Memorial was erected in DC in 1982. And in 1987, John Fogerty headlined this concert just outside of DC that was all about raising funds for the veterans who needed it. And he was joined by a lot of other superstars. Stevie Wonder was there, Crosby, Stills, and Nash were there, Chris Christopherson was there, Neil Diamond was there. But in many ways, Fogerty was the center of attention. He was the headliner. And the songs that he sung, his songs, were in many ways, if you really had to pin it down, they were emblematic of that Vietnam era. They were popular among the forces listening to radio in Vietnam. They were popular among the world at large. They were popular among people who were going into basic training. And one song, which was very emblematic of the era, which is somewhat in hindsight lost its power only because it's been used so much in Vietnam films. Family Guy even referenced how overplayed it is in films about the war. And that's, of course, the Creedence song Fortunate Son. But at the time, before it became overused in subsequent films and documentaries, it really captured a lot of the righteous indignation that a lot of people felt about a war where the poorest in society were conscripted, while the sons of businessmen, of magnates, of senators, of congressmen, and of other influential people were able to get deferments or otherwise get injured in ways that didn't affect their lives in any way, but that prevented them from going to battle. Several draft dodging people have even been elected president in subsequent years. You could argue that most of them in the last 40 years or so. Not casting aspersions, just reporting on the news there. And Fogerty, who was really in his prime because he never really lost that sound. He still sings great. If you see him live today, the same voice, same everything. And so you can imagine how he was really good in 87. And it really was like a homecoming of sorts for Vietnam veterans, reclaiming the 4th of July July as their own. Because in 1987, there hadn't been another major war. There were conflicts that US troops were in, volunteers rather than conscripts. But the last huge war that the country had fought up until that time was the Vietnam War. And the veterans, of course, most of them were still very much young people, young adults by 1987. And so it was very important to give them a proper tribute. Veterans of the Second World War, for instance, were celebrated at the time and have never ceased being celebrated. We could talk about Korea because that's an interesting story there as well, a forgotten war as such because of how Vietnam raged for so much longer and was that much more controversial. But it was a very important thing that John Fogerty did, and he really put his money where his mouth is by giving his time to that very important cause, along, of course, with the other artists who did so. And as I said, though, the reason I highlight him is because it's hard to communicate in words just how indelibly linked the music of a band like Creedence Clearwater Revival was with the people of the time, either fighting the war, protesting the war, thinking about the war, because a lot of people, especially in poorer areas, had a family member who was in that war, often not of their own choosing, but because their draft number was called and they didn't have the connections or the funds to get themselves out of that. And so he was singing for them, and it was really long overdue. Something like that could have happened in 1977, but it didn't. You had to wait till the war was long over, because of course it formally ended in 1975. So, a happy 4th of July to everyone, but particularly veterans, and particularly veterans who might feel unappreciated by those around them, by the media, and by people in charge. John Fogerty was always singing for such people, and many of those people were at that concert in 1987. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.